Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month's Digging In with TPS MTSU, of course, our last edition of the webinar for 2023. Really excited to have you join us today as we talk about the age of Jackson. So before we get into talking about all things Jackson and what was going on during his time, a couple of housekeeping things. Find my cursor for a second. All right, so again, for those of you joining us live, be sure that you keep your mics muted and make sure we're seeing your first and last name, just so we know who we're talking to. And then be sure to open up the chat box, introduce yourself, ask us questions, make comments throughout the presentation. We will be monitoring those and responding to that. And as always, we like to make these interactive. So if you get a chance to join us live, we highly encourage that. Or if not, just watching this later on, again, feel free to put your thoughts in the survey, which we'll talk about at the end. With this series, we do have a Padlet where you can find all of the resources and materials that are referenced in the session, as well as all of the sessions in this series since we started it back a couple years ago now. So a lot of stuff on that Padlet page. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Stacy to introduce our theme for the month and kind of get us going with thinking about Jackson.
Thanks, Kira. Before I share my screen and show everybody the newsletter and start going through that, I am going to start off with a poll question. So those of you who are joining us live get to answer a poll question. And those of you who are watching and cannot see everything on the screen, I will read out what the question and the answers are. So I have just launched the poll question. Feel free, and you have to scroll down to get all of the options. So do not forget that bar on the right-hand side. So the question is, which of the following were characteristics of the Jacksonian era? And, oh, there's only a single choice option. So I don't know if people are going to be able to choose more than one. Oh, well, do your best. So here are your choices. Expansion of railroads and canals, advancements in print and communications, rise of industrialism in the North, expansion of slave-based labor system in the South, white settlement of Indian lands, the Second Great Awakening, backlash against the enlightened aristocracy of the Revolutionary era, the rise of grassroots political party system, or all of the above. Okay, I'm gonna close out our poll, and the answer was all of the above. And I think that if you didn't get that right, it's only because you didn't scroll all the way to the bottom. But each of those different events, movements, were something that are very much a part of the historical context of this time period. And it makes it a very, very rich kind of look at early America in the first half of the 19th century. So now I'm going to share my screen and take a look at this issue. All right, so I hope that I've already enlarged it. I hope it's big enough to see. So there are some good links in the blurb. Basically, whenever we talk about eras, we have to define, okay, well, what are the dates that we're going to put on this era? And of course, your curriculum standards are going to have, certain dates that you may follow with your students. And then I've linked to a couple websites that have different suggested time periods for this. And so the first one I'm going to show you, this is a website some of you may have used. It hasn't been updated in a while. So it looks kind of like an old website, but it has some really good primary sources along with contextual material. And so it's usually pretty clear what's primary and what's secondary, which is not always the case with websites. So you have your introduction, background, and then some recommended documents and some fact sheets that have more primary source quotes on certain themes. So that's kind of a place you might find some things. And then the second one linked to from the blog, the blurb, pardon me, is the Tennessee for Me page. This is an older page within the Tennessee State Museum, but it still has good short contextual articles. Although I think they have like Flash plugin or something old that prevents you from seeing the images because it is an older part of the website that hasn't been updated. But they still have some good materials, so make sure you keep that bookmark and don't delete it. All right, going back, I just wanted to point out what the other links link to. This third link takes you to the Virginia Center for Digital History, the Miller Center of Public Affairs, and I found this to be an excellent contextual essay on the age of Jackson. So this is where I actually pulled out all those responses in the poll question. So it talks about economic change and industrialization. It talks about the politics and the political parties, the banking issue, of course, which is huge. And then it has a bibliography at the end. So this might be something that's good for high school students. I know they don't cover the age of Jackson, maybe in AP they would. Advanced 8th grade students might be able to handle this, but I would recommend this for teachers so that you all can have a really good background before you kind of launch into this. And there is, I believe, one more link on the blurb, and this takes you to an exhibit on the Digital Public Library of America, which I know Ken links to in his lesson idea, so we'll see this again later. Now, there's one more link I want to show you before we do launch into Ken's lesson idea, and that is the awesome source of the month. And what it is, it's a rare book that is not something that you can find online at the library's website, but you can find a little web video about it where you can see the images as part of this video. So we are going to take 3 minutes to watch this right now. And okay, what this is about is an assassination attempt on Andrew Jackson. So he was the first president that was almost assassinated in office that we know about. Okay, so I am going to play this video, and I am going to try to, after I press play, I'm going to try to make it sound better within the webcast. So be patient in case it doesn't sound very good at the beginning.
DC.
The Law Library of Congress has an account of many trials in its rare book collection. This is an account of the trial of Richard Lawrence for his attempt on the life of President Andrew Jackson. This item was printed by William Mitchell, who operated out of 265 Bowery in New York City. Mitchell printed a variety of titles in the 1830s and took on a partner in 1837 named Turner. Other Mitchells continued to operate out of the same address into the late 19th century. On January 30th, 1835, an unemployed painter by the name of Richard Lawrence made the first attempt on the life of a sitting U.S. president, President Andrew Jackson. President Jackson had traveled to the Capitol building to attend a congressional funeral in the House wing. As the president exited the funeral, he approached the east portico of the Capitol. Lawrence drew a pistol from his pocket and fired, but only the cap fired. Even though he was 67 and in poor health, the president charged Lawrence with a cane. Before the president could reach him, Lawrence produced his second pistol and pulled the trigger. This pistol also misfired, allowing the president to reach Lawrence, who ducked to avoid being struck by the president's cane, which is what you see depicted here. The president reportedly yelled, "Let me alone, let me alone. I know where this came from." Lawrence was then subdued by onlookers, and the president was taken by carriage to the White House. The political environment at the time was highly charged due to the president's veto of the bill to reauthorize the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. Some believe Lawrence was the instrument of a Whig conspiracy, including the president himself. Despite these early claims, scholars now believe Lawrence acted alone and of his own accord. Lawrence claimed that the president had killed his father, a claim that was quickly revealed to be false. Lawrence also said that he was King Richard III, and the president's opposition to the Second Bank of the United States had denied him the ability to receive a dispensation owed to him by Congress. To bolster his claim he was a monarch, Warren stressed the part of royalty at trial, sporting a shooting jacket and cravat that you see depicted here. He also expressed some indignation at the fact that he was being judged by commoners. After the jury was instructed, Warren said, "It is for me, gentlemen, to pass upon you, and not you upon me." The jury found Lawrence not guilty by reason of insanity, and he was confined to an asylum for the remainder of his life, before passing away in 1861.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress.
Hey, well, that was colorful, despite the narrator's monotone. But I thought it was really interesting because it touches on the controversy with the bank, and it really also enhances Andrew Jackson's reputation as a man who really couldn't be killed. This wasn't the first person to shoot at him in his lifetime, and he, as an old man, even he's charged him down. And so your students might find that amusing. So this might be a great way to kind of, segue between different subjects, or start off a class about Andrew Jackson when you're about to get into something slightly less easy to follow, such as some of the lesson ideas that we will be exploring in this webinar. So with that, I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn things over to Ken. How can I stop sharing? There.
Awesome. Now I will attempt to share myself, so we shall see. Okay. Is that good? Everyone can see that? Awesome. So my lesson idea revolving around Jackson centered on the idea of the common man. So with the 1820s, the United States experienced a mass expansion of the people who could vote. A lot of property requirements in states had been dropped. And so now you have this truly mass democracy that some of the founders had looked on with fear emerging. And Jackson, in a lot of ways, is portrayed as harnessing that wave to propel himself into office. So the source that I settled on was a letter from North Carolina Senator John Branch to Jackson during the 1828 campaign. Now, when you're studying Jackson, of course, the end of the 1820s is going to be a tumultuous time for him. South Carolina is going to rise up politically against federal authority in imposing tariffs. That's going to eventually grow into the Nullification Crisis that Jackson has to deal with in typical Jackson fashion, with threatening to kill someone. That is his MO in most things. And what's interesting about this particular letter is the commentary that it leads into regarding both the corrupt bargain and this general common man narrative as to who Jackson was elected to represent. So with that, let me switch over. Did that switch into the PowerPoint slides? Awesome. It's been a while since the COVID lockdown days, so I'm a little rusty. I'm used to doing this in person. So let's take a look at John Branch, his letter, and what it can tell us about Jackson as president. And what this is really going to turn into is a tale of two letters. So I'm going to start out with the Branch letter, and then we're going to follow a rabbit hole down the path of another letter sent on Jackson's behalf an election earlier. That also goes into the history books as the starting point of the corrupt bargain accusation. So here is Branch's letter. I had a link to it in the lesson, and I've highlighted here a few of the key points. So in Branch's letter, he starts the first paragraph expressing some unease about the nullification crisis that was unfolding, about the tariff issue in South Carolina, which of course he is supposed to be representing. but ends that paragraph with a statement, "For my own part, it shall be my purpose rather to allay rather than foment them," talking about the tensions that were emerging. Shifting into paragraph 2, Branch diverts focus onto what was one of Jackson's favorite topics by 1828, which was the accusation that John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay had colluded with one another in 1824 to propel Adams into the presidency, despite Jackson having won the consent of the majority of voters in the popular vote. Branch says, "I verily believe that if it by any means Adams and Clay succeed," meaning succeed again in the election of 1828, that the subversion of the liberties of this people will be inevitably, or the, subversion of the liberties of this people would inevitably ensue. Everything, therefore, dear to freemen is at stake. By paragraph 3, we're in full-fledged flattery mode. Branch is playing up to Jackson's belief that he is the true heir of the will of the people. He goes on to say, "If elected, which I trust in God, you will be. You will owe your election to the people. Yes, sir, to the unbiased, unbought suffrages of the independent, grateful yeomen of this country. You will come into the executive chair untrammeled, free to pursue the dictates of your own judgment." Jackson apparently takes those words very literally, because that's exactly what he's going to do in issue after issue. The interesting part of this letter to me is the premise that a South Carolinian senator, who should at this moment be emitting steam from his ears over federal power, and possibly opposing Jackson and some of his viewpoints here, is playing up to his ideas on the previous election. And so to understand this, we need a little bit of context on the corrupt bargain itself. So in 1824, you've got 4 primary candidates. William Crawford is one. We're going to set him to the side for a moment. Even though he comes in third, he's not going to play into this overall story to near as great a degree. So the 3 big personalities are Henry Clay of Kentucky, John Quincy Adams, son of the former president, and of course, Andrew Jackson. In this popular vote, because you have so many unlanded individuals who previously were not able to vote, especially those moving into the Western territories, Jackson comes away with the popular vote win. He has positioned himself well as a champion of those individuals. John Quincy Adams comes in second, and Henry Clay actually comes in dead last. Now, we all know the Electoral College, that great American enigma, is what actually rules here. And despite a clear victory in the popular vote, Jackson lacks the number of electoral votes to win the presidency. And so the decision on who gets the big chair went to the House. Clay had reason to distrust and dislike both men in the number 1 and number 2 spots. He had had tiffs with both. He had had a difference of opinion with John Quincy Adams during the negotiations on the Treaty of Ghent. He and Jackson were political rivals in the Trans-Appalachian West. But Clay is crucial here because in not being able to be considered, he resumes his seat as Speaker of the House, which means he has considerable influence to steer the selection process as he sees fit. Ultimately, he throws his support behind John Quincy Adams rather than Jackson. Jackson is just a pill that he cannot swallow. At least that will be his assertion. But not long after Clay has announced his choice that he will support Adams, and a full 2 weeks before the House goes to its final vote, an anonymous letter is going to arrive that will claim that Clay had other motivations than what he was voicing. This anonymous letter will later be claimed by Pennsylvania Representative George Crimmer. He writes in January of 1825 to the newspaper Columbian Observer, and said that Clay had made his decision to support Adams in exchange for a promise that he would be appointed Secretary of State after the fact. And in this time period, remember, Secretary of State is actually the most logical stepping stone to the presidency that Clay coveted so much, not vice president, like we might assume today. Crimmer claimed to have evidence that could substantiate his claim, but he declined to testify before Congress to prove it. We'll come back to that later. When the House finally gives Adams the nod and he subsequently appoints Clay as Secretary of State, then Jackson and his supporters are ready to leap on Adams for selling out and subverting the will of the people. Now, Crimmer is also going to write profusely in support of Jackson. He was a Jacksonite through and through. And he's actually cut from the cloth that Jackson will draw on to create his victory later on in 1828. Crimmer is the definition of a common man. He was the son of a German immigrant storekeeper in Middleton, Pennsylvania. He had no higher education whatsoever and actually gloried in that. He accused his fellow congressmen of using the logic of college-educated gentlemen, a quality which he disapproved. He was even the leader post-political career of an anti-free school movement in Union County, Pennsylvania in 1834. When he levied his attacks against opponents, he used homely illustrations and uncouth language that he was contemned for by his fellow congressmen as unsuitable for his office. And he bemoaned the necessity of any expenditures by the federal government and, ironically, given his support of Jackson, any centralization of power. He spoke out against pork barrel graft unless pork was on the menu for him, at which point he would always demand his fair share. Now, what's interesting about Crimmer is that this might be the exact kind of person, given how we typically teach the spoil system, that Jackson would reward later on with a job in the federal government. He is launching the corrupt bargain accusation that will lead to Jackson's victory 4 years later. However, despite his steadfast support, he doesn't receive a single office. Some authors have pointed to the fact that Jackson was unable to spell Crimmer's name properly when he references him in letters, saying that this means that Jackson was only tangentially aware of him. But given that Jackson once remarked that he couldn't trust a man who couldn't think of more than one way to spell a word, I'm skeptical of those claims. This makes Crimmer, again, exactly the kind of person that Jackson typically appealed to. Crimmer's son would give evidence later that the relationship was much closer than would seem. He recalls that his father treasured a cane given to him by Jackson that bore the inscription "Friendship." And he later revealed that his father's unwillingness to testify before Congress was because he had made a promise to a friend who actually gave him the info never to divulge his name, and so stood aside out of a sense of loyalty. But what about Branch? Branch is going to go on, after writing his flattering letter to Jackson, to receive the high post of Secretary of the Navy. Branch, though, is everything that Jackson claimed not to support. He was born wealthy just outside of Halifax, North Carolina. He enjoyed all the privileges of a country planter. He was college educated and extensively read in the law. He had used his family wealth to purchase a considerable estate in North Carolina that he runs until the age of 29, when he follows the path of most Southern gentry and enters politics. He'll serve first in the state Senate and then later as governor for 3 terms. He'll then return to the state Senate before ascending to the U.S. Senate in 1823. He was in that position when he was writing to Jackson in 1828. But unlike Crimmer, Branch was awarded Secretary of the Navy, which he will hold until 1831 when he resigns over the Eaton affair. He then goes on to serve additional terms in the U.S. House, the North Carolina Senate, and later on the appointed governor of Florida under President Tyler. What I like about these 2 sources is they open up for a deeper discussion on how Jackson approached this concept of the common man. Was he actually their representative in office, or was he definitely playing a part that got him to the high station he desired? The circumstances suggest that while Jackson held strong appeal for the poor, less educated masses, who had recently gained suffrage, he was unable or unwilling to grant those supporters the same favor he bestowed upon his wealthier, more politically connected supplicants. We often look at Jackson as a turning point, and in many ways he was, but he also never truly escaped the mores of the presidents who came before him and the aristocracy of sorts that persons in power within the federal government at this time often owed their positions to. So that was my deep dive, my rabbit hole. I'd never heard of either of these two gentlemen before I really started digging around on Jackson. But I think, especially for a high school class, given the period language of both pieces, it's a little bit more difficult. But for a high school class, especially a high-level high school class, these would be excellent sources. And even if you're not going to have students read the sources, just contextualizing the personas of the two individuals can give a lot of insight into how politics are actually working in this period.
Thank you, Ken. And that is a great segue into my kind of deep dive into the nullification crisis. So I think that kind of helps to set up a few things, and we're going to kind of get into some of the details. I know as I started this, knew a couple things about the nullification crisis, but definitely learned some very interesting things as I jumped into this topic for the newsletter. So just a couple things as like kind of background to understand kind of what happened to get things started. Of course, all of that context with the corrupt bargain and all that stuff is going on. Well, in 1828, there was a tariff that was passed. It was called the Tariff of Abominations. And it sought to protect agricultural products in the North and the West, but unfortunately also caused the cost of living in the South to go up, which angered many, especially the slaveholding elite in the South. And it also had some ramifications for some of the Northern industrials as well. There was a lot of pushback on this tariff. John Quincy Adams supported the bill as it passed in that spring. And this was really detrimental to his reelection campaign that year. It is cited as one of the things that helped Jackson be elected that year. John Calhoun, who was Jackson's vice president at this time, after the tariff is passed, anonymously writes this South Carolina Exposition and Protest, which lays out kind of in detail for the first time the whole concept behind nullification. And again, he did this anonymously because, again, the man is running as the vice president of the United States. And he was trying to play off that it wasn't him. So you have, again, this anger over the tariff. Again, there's a lot of anger throughout the states, especially in the South. But South Carolina, again, this is where the anger is really manifested. So what happens over the course of the next few years is that continues to amplify. And it's, it becomes clear because people weren't real sure on whether Jackson was for or against the idea of nullification. He was known to be generally supportive of the idea of states' rights. He was a slaveholder himself, so might he support this argument that they were making? So they were real unsure about where he stood on this issue for a while. It's in 1830 that he finally kind of makes a toast at a dinner one night that was being held in honor of Jefferson's birthday, where he lays out again kind of his support for the Union. So Calhoun is angered even more when a second tariff is passed, and so he decides that the best thing that he can do to support the nullification idea and he gets to support this what South Carolina is trying to do is to resign as vice president. So in 1832 he resigns and goes back to the Senate. And then he leads this effort in South Carolina, drumming up support primarily from the slaveholding politicians that were elected to the state legislature. And they gained more seats that year in that election. And so they are actually able to get enough seats to call a convention where they pass this ordinance of nullification. And in it, they're again arguing that states have the right to nullify any federal law or to just secede from the Union. And this is really kind of thought, they're making the argument that these tariffs were being done intentionally to impoverish the South, to impoverish slaveholders as a way to attack the institution of slavery. So they saw this as their way to protect, their right to own slaves. And it really also it lays out the political and ideological foundation for Southern nationalism that we know, of course, is going to have ramifications going forward. So within the lesson idea, there you can see the ordinance for nullification. This is actually a document that the National Archives has. It is very legalese. It's not going to be very exciting for students. So this might be one where you want to just kind of pull out a couple of sentences. You might note here, again, this is the there's 3 pages that are available from the National Archives. And this is the second one. The first paragraph is just laying out again why they think that the tariff that Congress has passed is unconstitutional and wrong. And so you see here in the last sentence that, again, they're just saying that essentially that the Congress has exceeded its power to impose taxes and collect revenue, that what they're doing is unconstitutional. And so then the next paragraph kind of lays out, again, their case for nullification. So this is what we're going to nullify this law. So it kind of starts here at the very bottom, unauthorized by the Constitution of the United States and violates the true meaning and intent thereof and are null, void, and no law, nor binding upon the state, its officers, or citizens. All promises, contracts, and obligations made or enter into, essentially, we're not going to do it. So again, we aren't doing this. And then in the next paragraph goes further to say that essentially the state legislature, actually, no, that's the third paragraph. That the next one is it's unlawful for anyone in the state or any federal individual, someone who's working on behalf of the federal government, to come into the state and try to actually enforce the tariff. And then it goes on to say essentially the state legislature is going to use all of its new claim powers to pass any law necessary to make sure that, again, this tariff cannot be enforced. So it's not just that we're going to ignore the law, but it's like we're going to do everything possible to make sure that you can't enforce this law in the state. So Jackson, he had feelings about this. So again, as I mentioned, generally in favor of states' rights, but not a fan of the idea of nullification. And so he issues a proclamation to Congress on December 10th, 1832. So shortly after this ordinance is passed. And one of the lines in this very long proclamation, because again, he had thoughts, is disunion by armed force is treason. So you can kind of get a sense that, again, how he is feeling about this. So I linked to the full proclamation. Again, it is very lengthy. Definitely not something that you probably want to read all of. Definitely not something you would put in front of your students. I did find this one particular passage to be really, really interesting. And so I think if I were only going to pick one passage out of the whole proclamation, this is the one that I might focus on. And so a couple things that are here, if I can get go back. So, and I hate this black bar here. It's always in my way. All right. So the states severally have not retained their entire sovereignty. It has been shown that in becoming parts of a nation, not members of a league, they surrendered many of their essential parts of sovereignty. The right to make treaties, declare war, levy taxes, exercise exclusive judicial and legislative power were all of them functions of sovereign power. The states then, for all these important purposes, are no longer sovereign. The allegiance of their citizens was transferred in the first instance to the government of the United States. They became American citizens and owe obedience to the Constitution of the United States and to laws made in conformity with the powers it vested in Congress. This last position has not been and cannot be denied. And then he goes on to ask some rhetorical questions about sovereignty and kind of what the states are doing. But again, laying out what is sovereignty and the fact that, again, the states do not have sovereign power. And then he goes on to talk about treason. So what shows conclusively that the states cannot be said to have reserved and undivided sovereignty is that they expressly ceded the right to punish treason. Not treason against their separate power, but treason against the United States. Treason is an offense against sovereignty, and sovereignty must reside with the power to punish it. But the reserved rights of the states are not less sacred because they have, for their common interest, made the general government the depository of their powers. The unity of our political character commenced with its very existence. Under the royal government, we had no separate character. Our opposition to its oppression began as united colonies. We were the United States under the Confederation, and the name was perpetuated, and the Union rendered more perfect by the federal Constitution. In none of these stages did we consider ourselves in any other light rather than forming one nation. Treaties and alliances were made in the name of all. Troops were raised for its joint defense. How then, with all these proofs, under all changes of our position we had, essentially, how have all this happened and we've never changed this thought? So again, he's saying out that nullification is not a thing. And in fact, you don't have sovereignty, so what you're doing is treasonous. So again, as you can see here, like you could, talk to students about, what he's laying out here, about sovereignty. Think about that in relation to what they have learned about the Constitution and ideas of federalism, and how these two go together. So definitely some interesting things that you could bring into conversation with your students from this passage alone. So again, Jackson has really strong words and thoughts about what's going on. He goes even further, though, and he lays out in a letter to Martin Van Buren, just about a month after he makes this proclamation to Congress, about what he plans to do, what he would like to do to the nullifiers to address this issue. And he says, many nullifiers are here under disguise, so here in DC, working hard to save Calhoun and would disgrace their country. Be assured that I have and will act with all the forbearance to do my duty and extend that protection to our good citizens and the officers of our government in the South, who are charged with the execution of the laws. But it would destroy all confidence in our government, both at home and abroad, was I to sit with my arms folded and permit our good citizens in South Carolina, who were standing forth in aid of the laws, to be imprisoned, fined, and perhaps hung. Was this to be permitted, the government would lose the confidence of its citizens and would induce disunion everywhere. No, my friend, the crisis must be met now with firmness, our citizens protected, and the modern doctrine of nullification and secession put down forever. For we have yet to learn whether some of the eastern states may not secede or nullify if the tariff is reduced. South Carolina has closed our courts and authorized the governor to raise 12,000 men to keep them closed, giving all power to the sheriffs to use their army as a posse. I must appeal to Congress to clothe our officers and marshal with the same power to aid them in executing the laws and apprehending those who may commit treasonable acts. Was I therefore to act without the aid of Congress or without communicating to it, I would be branded with effitant tyrant. The parties in South Carolina are arming on both sides and drilling in the night, and I expect soon to hear that a civil war of extermination has commenced. I will meet all things with deliberate firmness and forbearance, but woe to those nullifiers who shed the first blood. The moment I am prepared with proof, I will direct prosecutions for treason to be instituted against the leaders. If they are surrounded with 12,000 bayonets, our marshal shall be aided with by 24,000 and arrest them in the midst thereof. Nothing must be permitted to weaken our government at home or abroad. So again, while he had strong words to Congress, we can see here even stronger words in his private communications to Van Buren about what he says is going on. And what I find really interesting in this is, again, kind of laying out what's going on in South Carolina. Again, what the state has done, the fact that they're raising troops, and that the idea of bloodshed is a very real threat to what is going on. So what happens? Congress passes the Wilkins Act, also known as the Force Bill, which is what the nullifiers called it, in early 1833. And this gives Jackson the power to send in federal troops to make sure that the tariff is being collected. Of course, this kind of amplifies the tension. So there are a group of senators, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun, who begin to negotiate a compromise, which includes a new tariff that the South Carolinians can, get on board with, or at least are a little less mad about, and that South Carolina will repeal its nullification ordinance. So that's what happens, and essentially things kind of, the tension dies down a bit. Now, the bad thing, nullifiers stay in control of the state government there. Again, this is primarily elite slaveholders, and they have pushed out the Unionists who were opposed to the idea of nullification to begin with. And they also force the idea of an oath of allegiance to the state. And the tension over this oath of allegiance goes on for a couple years before they basically, make this compromise that an allegiance to the state is the same thing as an allegiance to the U.S. Constitution, which I don't know how that really worked out, but that was their argument. And of course, this reminded me of the famous saying from 1860, South Carolina is too small for a republic, but too large for an insane asylum. So again, we see again how one crisis connects to another. And again, this gets back to, again, the larger question of why the nullification crisis is so important and why students need to have a good understanding of it, is thinking about how Lincoln responds to the secession crisis in 1860, having seen what Jackson did during nullification. And so, again, thinking about how these two events correlate, how the nullifiers were dealt with after the crisis is averted, how those who secede and how the Confederates are dealt with in the Reconstruction period. So you can see a lot of correlations, and I think that is one where there's definitely some areas that you could bring in and discuss with students. So I've linked to, there's lots of great articles that I've linked into the lesson idea for background and context. So hopefully this is something that you can make use of with your students. And if nothing else, maybe you learned a little something about nullification that you didn't know, because I know I sure did. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Stacy.
Okay, thanks. We are going to look at a different individual right now, but one who is very important for understanding the context of all these same issues in the Jacksonian era. So I am going to go to, all right, can you see the newsletter now? And I'm going to turn to the top of page 3, and we are going to talk about the legacy of Chief Justice John Marshall, who is one of the longest serving Chief Justices we've ever had. And his tenure in office stretches from the very beginning of the 19th century to like the 1830s. So he is a very tangible connection between the Jacksonian era and the founding fathers. He is a founding father who is still around and still making history into the Jacksonian era. And he is responsible for making the Supreme Court and the judicial branch so important in the United States government, and kind of elevating it to really achieve the kind of same amount of power as the executive and the legislative branches. And so he's responsible for setting so many precedents that are still being used by the Supreme Court today. So he's very important. He has a curriculum standard all of his own. So this lesson idea looks at 3 of his most influential decisions, and they are Marbury versus Madison, McCulloch versus Maryland, and Gibbons versus Ogden. And we're not going to get into the details in this webinar, but it is linked to in this lesson idea. So I'm just going to very, very briefly, in like one phrase, review the main import of each of these trials. So Marbury versus Madison is where the concept of judicial review is established, that gives the court, the Supreme Court, the right to decide which laws are constitutional or not. And so that kind of checks the legislative branch. And McCulloch versus Maryland, that's the one, I believe, its implied powers is, in my mind, the phrase that goes with McCulloch versus Maryland. So basically, if the United States has the right to establish this second national bank, or actually, if they have the right to tax, then they should have the right to create the apparatus by which these things can be done. So in other words, Implied powers means the government can do things that aren't literally listed in the US Constitution, but are necessary for doing things such as levying taxes that are literally in the Constitution. And so this, of course, is going to be very, very important and evoked, especially during this very turbulent time where there's very real and violent disagreement about powers that are vested in the federal government versus powers that are reserved by state. And then Gibbons versus Ogden is the case that pretty much says that Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. And it had to do with Steamboat Company. And so there's a question about, well, this would be clear if it were on land, but this is on water. And, you know, how are these water lines and water kind of commerce covered? And so it kind of establishes that, yes, the Congress does have the right to legislate, you know, to cover that and to legislate on that. And so basically, each of these decisions establishes and supports and sustains the power of the federal government versus any kinds of opposition to that. And it really strengthens the executive branch and the legislative branch, while also, of course, the judicial branch for having the ability to decide what's legal or not for everybody else. So there are a few links that are included with each of those. The links to the decision are the actual decision, you know, that's written out. And those are, of course, all at the Library of Congress. But the summary links are to the landmarkcases.org website that we used a lot when we did a previous issue about landmark Supreme Court cases. And Kira did a lesson idea in that previous issue about Marbury versus Madison. So if you want to look at how you might teach that to go along with this, then there's a link in there. And the decisions themselves, again, this kind of language, especially legal language, set in the early 19th century is very hard for students to decipher. So the landmarkcases.org does a really good job about putting things into words that students can understand. But if you do look at the original words, the word repugnant comes up a lot. And okay, there are other words too, but that one really stood out to me because I thought your students would be like, repugnant, and they might think of it as, you know, being disgusting, but what it really means is just contradictory. And so that links to an online legal dictionary where you might be able to find other words too that would help you if you were looking at some of the direct quotes. Okay, but what I want to do over the next few minutes is a slightly different part of this lesson idea that also discusses a less significant instance, but still showing, you know, illustrating the importance of John Marshall for setting precedent. And that is, I'm going to read from the second paragraph here. So one of John Marshall's first acts as Chief Justice, because he was appointed as John Adams was going out. So Thomas Jefferson is coming in and he's stuck with this guy. But, you know, they're going to be professional about it, right? So Marshall has to administer the oath of office in 1801 to Thomas Jefferson. And this is only the second time that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has at all administered an oath of office to an incoming president, because this is only the third president, right? So there's not yet, it's not like, okay, this is how this goes. This is how we do it every single time. There's still some questions about, okay, how is this, are we going to do it this way? So this is just a really, again, a tale of two letters, maybe a brief exchange where they just politely kind of try to figure out, okay, how's this going to go? So I don't know, because I thought this was neat, I created a worksheet, and here it is. So it links to the, if you want to see the full letter, for instance, you can find it on the Library of Congress, but it's not transcribed on the Library of Congress. it is transcribed here on the worksheet, and I got that transcription. Well, first I actually did it myself, and then I found it online, and I'm like, oh, well, that was fun for nothing. But the National Archives website has not only does it have a transcription of each of these letters, but it has some contextual kind of explanatory notes at the bottom too. So those could be very helpful. But I just took a chunk out of each of them and, you know, show students, okay, this is what this looks like, but you don't have to read that, so don't freak out. So basically, Jefferson says to Marshall, now this all takes place on March the 2nd, 1801. So this is like 2 days before. So, you know, you're not leaving things to the last minute. No. I propose to take the oath or oaths of office as president of the U.S. on Wednesday the 4th instant. That's just a way of marking dates. At 12 o'clock in the Senate chamber, may I hope the favor of your attendance to administer the oath. As the two houses have notice of the hour, I presume a precise punctuality to it will be expected from me. I would pray you, in the meantime, to consider whether the oath prescribed in the Constitution be not the only one necessary to take. It seems to comprehend the substance of that prescribed by the Act of Congress to all officers, and it may be questionable whether the legislature can require any new oath from the president. I do not know what has been done in this heretofore, but I presume the oaths administered to my predecessors are recorded in the Secretary of State's office. So maybe he's being a little bit passive aggressive there, but it is Thomas Jefferson. That's the way he is. And so to that, Marshall writes, I am this instant honored with yours of today. So in other words, thanks for your letter. Not being the Secretary of State, and only performing the duties of that office at the request of the president, because he had been Secretary of State under Adams before Adams promoted him to Chief Justice. The request becomes indispensably necessary to give validity to any act which purports to be done on the 4th of March. In the confidence that it will be received, I shall immediately proceed to sign the C letters. Don't know what that means. No form is prescribed. Any letter desiring me to do the duties of the office generally on the 4th of March will be sufficient. I shall with much pleasure attend to administer the oath of office on the 4th, and I shall make a point of being punctual. All right, so they're both going to be on time. That's been established. The records of the Office of the Department of State furnish no information respecting the oaths which have heretofore been taken. That prescribed in the Constitution seems to me to be the only one which is to be administered. I will, however, inquire what has been the practice. So in other words, okay, it doesn't really say much, but you can ask students kind of what they think the tone is of these letters, and also what was decided and who decided it. So John Marshall decided it, even though he's confirming what Thomas Jefferson suggested. And so, in other words, you're putting that power into the hands of this Chief Justice, and he's going to be like, okay, this is how we're going to do it. I agree, your idea sounds good, but all right, we've both established that I'm the person who's going to make this decision. And so it does kind of also show how the Constitution is the blueprint for going forward. And who better than the Chief Justice to interpret the Constitution for everybody else? That's their job. And there are tons and tons of really great photos of John Marshall and John Marshall statues all over the United States, because he is so influential on our system. So I just included one up here. You can obviously do a search and find a lot more to go with it. I'm going to stop my lesson idea and turn things back over to Kira. Okay, did I stop it? Oh, wait,
No.
wait. Hold on. I'm getting there. The black box is in the way. There we go.
Yes, the cursed Zoom black box. So thank you guys so much. I know we're kind of running short on time, so we're not going to really have time to dig into the page 4 items, but know that the other really cool thing about this period is the breadth of political cartoons, so that we link to several of those, and that's actually what the other lesson idea is on. So feel free to check that out. And again, there's some other great things that are linked on page 2 of the newsletter. But hopefully we've given you some some things to think about as you teach this period that maybe will be beneficial to you. If this is something that you teach and you're interested in learning more about, we're going to be doing a workshop in partnership with the Hermitage on January the 27th. Registration for that workshop is now open, and I am happy to you can find information for that on our upcoming workshops page on the website, and I can also email information about that to those of you who participate in this webinar and complete the survey form. I'll send you the link for that. So again, just a quick reminder, of course, the Padlet, where you can find all of the resources for this session, including the PowerPoints that we use. So if that's something that you want to adapt and make use of, you can access them there. We do, of course, want your feedback, and this is how we collect information in order to do PD certificates. So whether you're joining us live today or going to watch this later for credit, be sure to complete this form using either the link here or the QR code to access it. I check the surveys about once a week, and so we'll send out the forms or your Pure PD certificate once I check that every week. So again, if you don't have it within a week or so, just drop me an email and let me know. We will be taking a break in January, so there will not be a Digging In webinar in January. We will resume in February, so you can join us then. But as I mentioned, in January, we do have the workshop with the Hermitage, and that will be the first in our Tennesseans Who Shaped American Democracy series. We'll be doing 3 of those in the spring, and you can find more information about that on our upcoming workshops page. Again, thank you guys so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you in 2024.